In today's lesson, what I want to look at is something I referenced in Wednesdays, and we find it in Genesis, and it's the story of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And I want us just to look at that and just expound a little bit on something I said on Wednesday's video. So when we look at this situation, we see that God created all of everything. He created the garden. He put Adam and Eve in there. He created Eve from Adam. He set them in there. He gave them instructions. We find this in chapter 2 specifically. He gave Adam the instructions. There is a tree that they were told not to eat. So we see two trees, the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Pardon me. And so when we look at this, we pick it up the story in chapter 3, and we see in verse 1 of chapter 3, it says that the serpent was more cunning, or the King James says subtle, than any beast of the field that the Lord God had made. Now this is the specific, this serpent was very specific. But when it says he was cunning or subtle, there's this play in the Hebrew from which this is translated. And that is the root word that later shows up as naked, when Adam and Eve realized we're naked. It's this subtle or cunning is the root word for that. And I think that's important. We're going to jump down a little bit further and read. He says, when he's speaking to Eve, the verse 6, the serpent said to the woman, after she told him, we can't eat, we can't even touch that tree, he says, what? He says, you will not surely die, for God knows in the day that you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. Knowing, being able to discern and figure out good and evil. So he says, you're going to be like God. God says, this is what's good and this isn't good. In fact, that's why he said, don't eat of the tree. When you eat of this tree, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, it leads to death. We find elsewhere in the scriptures that God says, I set before you life and death. He says, choose life. He tells us that there's a way that seems right to a man, but it leads to death. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil was the way that leads to death. Not life. Life was to actually listen to and seek and believe and follow the counsel of wisdom from the Creator. The knowledge of good and evil, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil was about, I get to decide what's right and wrong on my own, which is really silly and illogical when we look at it. How could I, a created individual, think that I know more than the one who created me? And yet that's what the world has done ever since this. Let's read on a little bit more in the text into verse 6, actually. I'm sorry, I was in verse 5 before that, verse 4 and 5. In verse 6, so when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, she saw it looked good to her after the serpent said, hey, you'll be able to figure out and make your own decisions about right and wrong. And it was pleasant to her eyes, and a tree is desirable to make one wise. Notice, to make me wise, not to lean upon and trust in the wisdom of the one who is wisdom, who is truth. All right, so this is what's happening. And so she took of it and ate it, and then she gave it to Adam. Now notice in the situation where the serpent says, hey, it's not going to work like God said. Eve and Adam had a father who created them, who is the creator and all wisdom. Notice they could have stopped. She could have stopped, and then he could have. I mean, we read in Timothy, she was deceived, but Adam wasn't. But why was it not a stop? Okay, you tell me this, serpent. Let me go talk to my dad about this. Why did Adam not consult wisdom? Because they were seeking and believing they could make themselves wise. And so it was after this that they realized, in verse 7, then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they knew that they were naked. And so they sewed up fig leaves to cover themselves. And then God shows up, and they hide. They run away from him instead of to him. It's really interesting because now they have discerned not just that they're naked. They knew they could understand they were naked because they didn't have clothes on. So notice the making of clothes was something different. They didn't put those on before because they were oblivious to that they didn't have clothes. No, because now they have shame. They've decided it's not good to be naked. They decided good and evil, right and wrong for themselves. Because actually God says when he finds them in the garden and they say, well, we were afraid, we were ashamed because we were naked. And he said, who told you that? The tree of the knowledge of good and evil that we've all inherited things from is this notion and this thought that we can decide for ourselves rather than go to our Father, who is the source of wisdom, who loves us. There's something profound and important in that lesson.